Hi, everyone. I'm Wiley Blevins, and I would like to welcome you to my brief presentation today on phonics and the science of reading. For those of you who aren't familiar with my work, I am the author of the International Literacy Association brief on phonics called Meeting the Challenges of Early Literacy Phonics Instruction. This brief is available on their website. It's free and downloadable and ready to share with teachers, with families of your students, and so on. And in this paper, I discuss the 7 characteristics of strong phonics instruction, as well as the 10 reasons why phonics instruction sometimes fails. I'm also the author of several professional development books, as well as instructional programs, including From Phonics to Reading by Sadlier. I would like to thank Sadlier for generously sponsoring me for this talk. So we're currently engaged in this national conversation around what people are calling the science of reading. And all it really is emphasizing the fact that we have this large body of knowledge on how children learn to read. Some of this knowledge comes from us, classroom practitioners and educational researchers, but there are these other sciences that have been looking at how children learn to read, such as linguists and cognitive scientists who do brain research and so on. And they have given us some insights into how to improve the instruction that we are delivering our students. What is sad about this information is that it's largely unknown by classroom teachers because it's largely untaught in our colleges of education, although that is starting to change. And unfortunately, some of the most popular and widely used programs in the United States either haven't taken advantage of this larger body of knowledge from these other sciences or have chosen not to incorporate that information into their programs. There are a lot of things that are talked about under the umbrella of science of reading, but I want to point out that the science of reading is not a program and it's not a philosophy. It's just this body of information that continues to grow and evolve as we learn more. And we live in a really great time right now where we're getting all of this important information that can help us fine-tune our instruction. Some people erroneously say that the science of reading is just focused on phonics. It's not only about phonics, but it is about doing phonics better along with many other things. And one of the really interesting aspects about the conversation around the science of reading is that these old models of reading have reemerged, and they really put phonics in its proper place. So for example, some of you might be hearing about the simple view of reading, which came out in the mid-1980s, developed by Guff and Tunmer. And what they said is that in order for us to comprehend or understand what we read, it is a product of our ability to decode words or access words on the page through phonics and so on, and our language comprehension skills. So our vocabulary, our background information. We need both of these things in order to understand what we read. So if in the early years, we put all of our eggs in the decoding basket, and we aren't simultaneously developing students' language comprehension skills, building their vocabulary and their content knowledge, as they move up through the grades and encounter increasingly more complex texts, it will be difficult for them to handle those texts because they don't have all the tools they need. Likewise, if we don't put enough of our energies in the decoding basket and students move through the grades and they aren't efficient, fluent decoders as they move up the grades and encounter this increasingly more complex text, this lack of decoding ability, this inefficiency will really impede their ability to understand what they read because their fluency will be so affected by this, and it'll be much more difficult for them to get through those texts. So we need to focus on both in our early reading instruction. In 2001, Scarborough developed her reading rope. You might be hearing about the reading rope as well, another model of reading. And what she did is she took these big buckets from the simple view of reading, decoding, and language comprehension, and really spelled out some things that we need to think about in our teaching in each of these big buckets. So when we look at the decoding bucket, of course, you see decoding. So that involves a lot of the work we do in our phonics instruction. There's also phonological awareness, and we know that some of the phonemic awareness tasks like oral blending and oral segmentation are directly related to early reading and spelling development. And also sight word recognition. How do we automatically retrieve words in our memory? We're going to talk a little bit about that process called orthographic mapping. In the language comprehension bucket, of course, there's vocabulary and background knowledge, but other things like knowledge of language structures and so on. And her basic concept is, as we become more fluent in our word recognition abilities, we become more strategic in our language, in using our language comprehension abilities. We know more words, we have more content background knowledge, and these skills really begin to intertwine to give us all the tools we need to tackle increasingly more difficult tasks as we move from grade to grade. And that is our goal as teachers, to make sure our students have all the tools they need as they go from grade to grade to grade. So we know that phonics plays a really critical part, but it's one of many things that we have to look at in terms of our early literacy instruction. So I want to focus my attention today on sharing with you 4 guideposts of early phonics instruction that are related to the science of reading. We're going to briefly talk about scope and sequence, the importance of systematic and explicit instruction. I'm sure you've heard those terms many, many times. The importance of daily application to reading and writing, and also a little bit about assessment and what kinds of assessments really help us in terms of knowing what our students can and cannot do with respect to decoding words. So let's start with the first guidepost, scope and sequence. It's absolutely essential in the science of reading that we have a clearly defined scope and sequence, that our scope and sequence isn't random, it isn't book-based, it is clearly defined, and it serves as the spine of all of the instruction. A great scope and sequence will progress from easier to more complex, but it is also built for efficient mastery and transfer. So a scope and sequence is not just a list of skills. A scope and sequence really is just the starting point in a much longer, more in-depth, deep dive into the skills that you are working on. So after I introduce a phonics skill to my students, I have to systematically and purposely review those skills for about the next 4 to 6 weeks for most students to get to mastery in both decoding or reading words with that skill and encoding or spelling words with that skill. We know the encoding piece takes a lot longer. If we don't focus enough attention, students do okay reading words with the skill, but can't spell words with the skill. And so we need enough time to make sure all are in place. So 1 week of instruction, not enough for students to get to mastery, or most students to get to mastery in both reading and spelling. And mastery is only part of our goal because we want to make sure that they can master the skills so they can then transfer it to all reading and writing situations. So our goal really is to teach to mastery, to get there as quickly and as efficiently as possible. But unfortunately, a lot of our instructional materials are exposure focused. We teach one skill 1 week, we go to the next skill the next week, and on and on and on. If we don't hang on to those skills for a longer period of time, students don't get to mastery, and then they can't transfer those skills. So transfer is our goal. And if mastery and transfer are what we're going to focus on, then it really changes the way we teach, develop our lessons, and assess. And that's a critical part of phonics in the science of reading. In the work that I've done around the 10 reasons why phonics instruction sometimes fails, the #1 reason that I discuss with teachers and administrators is an inadequate or non-existent review and repetition cycle. So I encourage all of you to look at your scope and sequence for whatever phonics lessons you are teaching, and then look at the upcoming weeks after you've introduced that lesson. How many opportunities do students have to review and revisit and apply those skills in both reading and writing? And if it isn't enough, then we have to go in and rebuild that review and repetition cycle. The second guidepost of phonics in the science of reading is that the instruction is both systematic and explicit. And we hear those terms all the time. I want to talk a little bit about what they mean to me. When we talk about explicit instruction, we are really talking about the initial introduction of a skill. We are going to tell children that the S sound, for example, is represented by the letter S. We write the letter S for that sound. Our initial introduction is going to be explicitly stated instead of using a discovery method. In a discovery method, maybe we would write a bunch of words on the board and we'd have children figure out what all these words have in common. That really requires some prerequisite skills, noticing different sounds in words, noticing the letter connection to those sounds, being able to identify that letter, and so on. And if we use a discovery method in our initial introduction, it leaves too many children behind, and we don't want that to happen. So our initial introduction is explicit. That doesn't mean that during the phonics instructional cycle, there isn't time for students to really explore words and play with letters and sounds through activities like word building and word sorts, where we are talking about words and how English words work. These activities can be very powerful because they really help solidify and consolidate students' understanding of how English words work. And that is critical. We want to build really strong readers and spellers. So systematic instruction is teaching it as a system. When I was in first grade, my first grade teacher, Mrs. Wershaw, explained to us that there were these letters in this thing she called an alphabet. And throughout the year, she was going to teach us the sound for these letters by themselves and in combination. She explained the system to us. And it felt to me like a puzzle. Like I just had to figure out the sound for these strange squiggles. And because she taught us the alphabet like a system, I understood very quickly how it worked. And I began noticing other letters and words that she hadn't introduced yet and started figuring out some of those sound spelling connections. So if we teach it as a system, it can be very generative. But systematic also means that once you introduce a skill, you continue hanging on to that skill and reviewing it and so on, what I just explained about the review and repetition cycle. So an example of what systematic instruction looks like is shown here. In lesson 1, for example, in first grade, we're going to be working with short A. In lessons 2 through 5, we're going to be looking at the other short vowels, E, I, O, U. But in the activities, we are also going to be building in some continued work with short A in the blending work, in the dictation, in some of the words in the decodible text or the word building activities. So we're going to hang on to that skill, and we're going to assess the skill not just at the end of week or lesson 1, but we're going to review and assess that skill for many, many weeks after that. So we're going to take the long range view. So after we've worked with short A for many weeks, we're going to move to more complex skills. So we're going to work with skills like consonant blends and consonant digraphs. So we're going to still use short A in very simple words by going from the known to the new in very simple steps to make the new learning more obvious. So if we're going to work with a skill like a digraph, like CH in the word chat, we'll start with the word hat that students learned many, many weeks ago and compare it to chat and introduce the CH spelling for the ch sound and ask students, what do they hear that's different in these two words? What do they see that's different? This kind of very simple, obvious introduction to new skills, going from the known to the new, can be a really big aha for our early learners. Even when we move into long vowels, going from a short A word like ran to a long A word like rain. So here again, we're hanging on to that learning. We're comparing what we know to something that's new. It highlights that new learning, that there's a different sound when these two letters are together. Instead of the A sound, short A, we have the long A sound, A and AI. And we're going to continue to assess these skills, not only in our cumulative assessments and our comprehensive assessments, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but also we're going to be evaluating student writing. We know that writing lags behind reading. So if we see consistent and accurate use of a skill in students' writing, we know that they can use that skill in reading. And we're going to be listening to our students read and taking note of what kinds of words they have difficulties with and the pieces of those words that they struggle with. All of that information can really inform our instruction. Systematic does not mean that all children receive the same phonics instruction on the same day at the same time and only that instruction. I often hear people say, well, we use a program with the same scope and sequence, everyone's in the same place. That's not how it is really designed to work. In fact, what makes phonics instruction a bit complex is that you need two things going on simultaneously. All children need to be exposed to grade level instruction during whole groups. So for many of our students who are meeting grade level expectations, that instruction really meets their needs. But for our students who are above grade level expectations or below grade level expectations, that instruction is going to need to be differentiated and maybe some modifications made. So for example, if we are reading a decodable reader in first grade that's focusing on long A spellings, and you have some students who are still struggling with short vowels, they're going to need some scaffolds for that particular text. They might need to listen to it in an ebook version before they read it with the whole group. You might have to do an echo read of the book with them in small group before they get to the whole group so that they can more fully participate in that whole group lesson. If you are rereading that book to develop fluency, that whole book might be very challenging for a child who's still working with previous skills. So maybe they only work on fluency with a tiny portion, maybe a page or a paragraph of that book, and that's all you hold them accountable for at that point. If you're doing a word sort and you have 10 words with a particular skill, that could be overwhelming to a child who's still working on previous skills. So maybe only have them sort 4 or 5 words, a smaller subset, so that they get some learning, they get some content out of that lesson, but you don't overwhelm them. But exposing them to grade level content is really important, because what's happening in too many schools is that students are assessed at the beginning of the year, placed at some point in a phonics continuum. So for example, you might have first graders who are still working on kindergarten skills. So they're placed in a kindergarten scope and sequence. They move very slowly. And by the time first grade ends, they're not exposed to far too many of the first grade skills. So they go into second grade even further behind. And that's one of the dangers of not exposing children to grade level content. But you have to address those skills that they do not know, especially if they're below grade level standards. So that is where small group differentiated instruction comes into play, where you can really target their needs, those learning holes. And if you have students who are above grade level expectations, that's a point where you can really accelerate that learning and move them further in that scope and sequence. So small group instruction for on-level students can give those students more guided practice and application to make sure they stay on track. Below level students build those previously taught skills, and above level students accelerate their learning along the phonics scope and sequence. That is what systematic means. The third guidepost is a really important one. It's daily application to reading and writing. I always say it's in the application where the learning sticks. Too often I go into classrooms and I see phonics instruction where there's a lot of isolated skill work happening. We don't get the movement, the learning that we need if students are just if students aren't applying the skill, if it's just this isolated skill and joke type work. We need children every day during a phonics lesson to pick up a book and pick up a pencil, because that is where everything comes together, everything comes into play. This became really obvious to me about 12 years ago when I started my work around finding out why phonics instruction in some schools wasn't having the impact that it needed to have. And so I started evaluating phonics instruction materials and phonics assessments, but also watching a lot of teachers teach. And these two teachers really exemplify what I saw. These were two teachers in the same school, the same hallway. They had 30 minutes for phonics instruction. Teacher A spent 10 minutes doing an action rhyme review. She would say letter, children would chant a rhyme. 10 minutes, she did some phonemic awareness around rhyme. 5 minutes, she introduced the phonics skill, modeled blending or sounding out some words. And 5 minutes, she had students read a connected story. So of the 30 minutes in her lesson, only 5 was spent on applying it to reading and no writing. Teacher B, 5 minutes, she did a review warm up. She had these letter cards. She would flash the letter cards and the students would say the sounds. So she was keeping those sound spellings fresh in their minds. She spent 5 minutes on phonemic awareness. She did oral segmentation. We know that children need to be able to orally segment words and think about the individual sounds and spellings in order to write words. So oral segmentation is one of those power phonemic awareness skills that's connected to early writing development. She spent 5 minutes introducing the phonics skills and modeling blending, just like teacher A, but she spent 10 minutes reading the story, the connected story. And she did something I rarely saw, but wish I saw in every lesson. She spent 5 minutes doing some writing follow-up. So the students read the story and then they wrote about it. And so of the 30 minutes of her instruction, 15 or half of it was spent applying the skill to reading and writing. And I believe at least half of every lesson should be spent in application. We teach a little bit, well, we start with some review, we teach a little bit of new learning, and then we apply, apply, apply. So I thought about these teachers a lot when I was doing this work and what it would mean if this is what's happening every single day in these classrooms, this difference in application time, understanding that it's in the application where the learning sticks. So teacher A, 5 minutes a day of application would give her students about 25 minutes a week, which would be 15 hours of application during the school year of those phonics skills. Teacher B, 15 minutes a day would give her students 75 minutes a week, which would be 45 hours of application during the school year. So these students have 30 more hours of application to get to mastery faster, to be able to transfer those skills. It's all about building that fluency. So the efficiency of our teaching really matters, and making sure we have the right mix of activities and the right amount of application can really change the impact of the instruction you are delivering for your students. So the application tool we use for most phonics instruction would be decodable text or phonics readers. I'm not sure what you call them. They have lots of different names. I refer to these as accountable text because they're texts that, since they are so closely related to or connected to my instruction, I can reasonably hold students accountable for their reading. And if students struggle reading books that are so closely connected to my instruction, it also holds me accountable. If they're struggling, it means there's something that's missing in my instruction, the amount of instruction or the amount of practice I'm giving them. So just to illustrate the power of these early decodable accountable texts, imagine for a minute that you are in my kindergarten classroom and you've opened a book and you see this picture, and you know these words because I taught you the words I, see. I've taught you that this symbol stands for the A sound and the word A. This symbol stands for the T sound, and this symbol stands for the K sound. So I want to show you a very simple sentence on the page with this photograph, and I want you to read it very quickly, and you will have no problems. On the count of three, read. 1, 2, 3. I see a cat. You all read that with great ease. Some of you might not think it was so easy, but you were all able to read it successfully. The only reason it might not have felt so easy to some of you is because you had just learned these sound symbol connections, just like our beginning readers. It takes time and lots of practice to become fluent with those sound symbol connections, but you are all able to read it successfully. So I think these accountable texts not only provide such great practice in getting to mastery using our phonics skills and our high frequency words, but they also build this sense of confidence and control over an early reader's ability. I want my students to really believe in their ability to do this thing called reading, and this daily success, because of this close connection, really builds that confidence. So just to illustrate that point a little bit further, I'm going to take away the picture and I'm going to give you a new sentence, and I've just added one additional word to make it slightly more difficult, but let's see how you do. I want you to read on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. So if we were together, my guess would be that many of you would be struggling to read this. And why would that be? Who is not doing their job? You, the reader, or me, the teacher? That's right, me, the teacher. Your lack of success with this text holds me accountable as a teacher. There's too much of a difference between what I've taught you and what I had you read, so you cannot successfully access this text. Unfortunately, in a lot of classrooms I go to, they learn skills like this during their phonics lessons, and they read books like this during their reading time, where there is very little connection and students can't apply those skills or use those skills, so they have to find other ways to attack that text. This is not a very difficult sentence. Pam can see a rabbit, but because of this disconnect, you weren't able to have a successful reading opportunity. Now imagine that's what's happening every day in classrooms. It's time for reading. You're having this lesson, you know you're going to get this text that you can't access very easily. How does that affect your motivation to read, or your thoughts about you as a reader? These words really matter. These kinds of texts really matter. So what is the best application tool for a phonics lesson? Well, interestingly, in this conversation we're having around the science of reading, early reading texts have become this new battleground. And part of it is because of these other sciences, like cognitive scientists who do brain research. And they have given us some insights into the effects of text on early reading development. So there's a famous brain research study out of Stanford that you might have heard about, because it gets a lot of attention. And what's fascinating about this study is they had these two groups. They created this new language that the sounds symbol system that they were teaching these two groups. They had one group where they taught via what we would call a phonics method, where they taught the symbol and the sound. So the participants had to put those together to read the words. And then the other group, they learned words as whole units. So very, very different, phonics versus whole word. And then they had the participants read, and they took these brain pictures, what are called functional MRIs, that show the parts of the brain that are activated during the reading process. So these parts light up, so we're able to capture what parts of the brain are working during the reading. And what they found, if you look at bullet number 1, beginning readers who focus on letter sound relationships or phonics instead of trying to learn whole words increase activity in the area of their brains best wired for reading. So the participants who were sounding out words, the parts of their brain that lit up, that were activated, were the same parts of our brains as skilled readers that light up. Really fascinating. If you look at the third bullet, words learned using a whole word method activated the right side of the brain, which was characteristic of children and adults who struggle with reading. So the whole word readers, their brain pictures were very different. Different parts of the brain were activated, lit up. And when they compared those functional MRIs to, here you see, children and adults who have difficulties with reading, there was some similarity. Really, really fascinating. The other thing that's particularly interesting about this study to me is that the participants who learned via the whole word method took off really fast. They only had to learn these big pieces of information, and they were reading texts where they just applied those big pieces of information, these whole words. But once new words were introduced where they hadn't learned them as whole units, they hit a wall, and they hit it hard because they hadn't looked at the individual pieces of the words they learned to take those individual pieces and apply them to these new words. So reading became very, very difficult. Whereas the participants who learned sounding out words start out very slowly. It was a lot of work. They had to think about every symbol and sound and put those sounds together. But once they got lots and lots of practice, they became more automatic, recognizing those symbol sound connections, and were able to move through those words more quickly. And any new word that was put into a story, they were able to attack it because they had all the tools. So they far surpassed the whole word learners. I think about this a lot, especially with our kindergarten students, those students who are learning using those decodible texts where they're spending a lot of time sounding out words, versus those students who are using those pattern texts where they're learning words as whole units. They might do okay because those early texts are very simple. There's a close connection between the text and the pictures, but what happens when that close connection between the text and the pictures begins to disappear? And they're introduced with lots of new words where they don't know the individual pieces. When will they hit a wall, and how many of them will hit a wall? These are important questions for us to ask ourselves as teachers. So one of the activities I do with kindergarten teachers is I take two texts from the same point of the year, one a pattern level text and one a decodable text. And we just think about how our students are accessing the words on the page. So this is a pattern level text. It's a level C book, and this used in the second half of kindergarten. It's an adorable book called Puppies Get Into Lots of Silly Spots. So you can read this with me if you want. Puppies get into lots of silly spots. 2 puppies are in the boots. Puppies get into lots of silly spots. 3 puppies are in the flowers. What do you think the next page says? You all know. Puppies get into lots of silly spots. 4 puppies are in something adorable. You already know what the next page says, pretty much, with the exception of maybe 2 words, because you recognize the pattern right away. You can apply that pattern. That's exactly what many of our students are doing. So when I took the words out of a couple pages of this book and we just coded them with the teachers. So all the words that students could fully sound out based on the phonics skills that were taught up to that point of the year, we coded in red. And you see there was only 1 word in each page. The blue words were high frequency words that we had taught so much that we felt confident they had become sight words. Students could automatically recognize those. We spent a lot of instructional time, and you see there were 2 words on each page. All the other words were green. So we worked through those and thought about how our students were really accessing those words. Puppies, maybe the initial letter, sound, and picture. Get, they hadn't learned short E. So the teachers were saying, well, we'd have to give that to them, maybe model sounding it out. Into is a high frequency word they hadn't learned. So the teachers said we'd have to give that to them. Lots, they hadn't learned short O. So the teacher said we'd have to give that to them, on and on. It became very clear that the way students were attacking this text was more of a whole word method. Memorizing the patterns, maybe learning some of the words as whole units, but that was really the main way in which they were attacking text day after day after day. Then we took a decodable or phonics reader from the same point of the year. This was the text. Can Sam sit? Sam can sit in the chair. Can the cat sit? The cat can sit. It sits on the mat. Now, not as exciting as puppies and flower pots and boots and what have you, but when you look at the coding of the words, you see all of these words in red that can be fully sounded out. A lot of practice developing fluency and mastery of those phonics skills. The blue words, the high frequency words that have become sight words, there were some of those, and then there was a story word. And so we'll talk about how we have to attack that word in just a minute. But you see the task of accessing the words on the page in these 2 different texts is very, very different. Now imagine if every day you're picking up these texts, and the main way in which you can get through these texts, or the easiest, most efficient ways to sound out the words, what are you going to use as a reader? What strategies are you going to use to attack that text? Hold on to that thought for a second, because also in this conversation about these beginning texts, there's a lot of conversation about the 3 cueing systems. You know, as skilled adult readers, we take all different sorts of information to access text and make meaning from the text. And so the question really is, what is it best to focus on for our early readers? And those visual clues, the graphophonics cues really seems to be the most have the most powerful impact for our early readers. Now we're at a point in the conversation around the science of reading where there's some really unfortunate things or interesting things, however you want to categorize them, happening in that states are starting to outlaw the use of the cueing systems, the teaching of the cueing systems. So it's a very strange thing to witness happening, because I know as adults we use all these cues. We want students to focus on the graphophonics, and so a lot of states are not buying any textbooks where the word cue is used, or outlawing the teaching of any cues or what have you. And why I understand why that's happening, I think a lot of this conversation is missing the point. It's not the teaching of the cues that's the problem. It's the text that we're using that's the problem, because it's the text that determines the cues children have to use. So if I have a pattern text and I can't sound out most of the words, I have to use other ways to attack the text. I'm sitting in the classroom, I'm 5 years old, everyone's looking at me. I have this text in front of me, I want to get through it. So I find other ways, looking at the pictures and using initial letters and guessing and so on. But if I have a text where most of the words I can sound out and I have all the tools to do that, and that works most of the time, that's going to be my go-to way of attacking those texts. So we're talking about the habits we develop in our early readers. It's really interesting to me when I'm working with a child who I haven't worked with before, who maybe the teachers say is struggling in reading, I will hand them a book, have them open to that first spread and see what they do. Do they put their finger on the first word and start working through it? Or do they open the book and they scan the page for the pictures for every little piece of information because they know they don't have the tools to access the text in the way we want them to? So a lot of things to think about around the power of early text. The interesting thing about this, and sort of the sad thing for me, is we've always known that text had this influence. For whatever reason, it sort of slipped from our awareness. When I first started teaching in the mid 1980s, there was a study that came out that had a huge impact on my thinking about what I would do with young learners. It was a study by Julian and Schneider. And this study in the mid 1980s, they were looking at the text used in first grade. So in first grade is when formal reading instruction really began, not like today where it's really beginning in kindergarten. So when you see first grade in the study, you could replace it with kindergarten. It would apply to what's happening today. But I want to read you this paragraph from their study that really affected me. The selection of text used very early in first grade, now kindergarten, may at least in part determine the strategies and cues children learn to use and persist in using. So the habits they develop, and subsequent word identification. In particular, emphasis on a phonics method seems to make little sense if children are given initial text to read where the words do not follow regular letter sound correspondence generalizations, meaning they can't sound out most of the words. And this is the sentence that really sort of kicked me to my knees. The types of words which appear in beginning reading text may well exert a more powerful influence in shaping children's word identification strategies than the method of reading instruction. So we can teach award-winning phonics lessons, but if we give students text where they can't use those skills, it really lessens the impact of that. So while people are really focused on outlawing the teaching of the cues, I think we need more attention to the text that we are using for early reading, because it may well exert a more powerful influence in shaping children's word identification strategies than the method of reading instruction. Just something to remember from long ago that's applicable today. So I find the current conversation a little troubling. It's very extreme, yes or no, black and white, good and bad, do this, throw out this. It's not a very nuanced conversation. And I have found throughout the decades, when this happens, when we don't have a deeper, more nuanced conversation, often surface learning occurs and things are misapplied or misunderstood. And so I'd like to have sort of a deeper conversation just for a few minutes about decodable text, because I'm hearing some very extreme things. So for example, I'm hearing people say, well, children in kindergarten and first grade can only read decodable text and they must be 100% decodable. So let me be very clear. There is absolutely no research of any percentage of decodability. It does not exist. I have read every single research on decodable text. There aren't a lot, but I've read them all. There are no studies that talk about percentages. People have made some determination about a percentage. We'll talk about it in a second. And if you think about this from sort of a more realistic, logical kind of standpoint, if we're saying that children can only read decodable text in kindergarten and first grade, that would mean that a lot of these high frequency words that are irregular, like the word the most common word in English, children would never be able to encounter. We'd never want that to be the case. In fact, when I looked at the top 250 high frequency words in English, about 60 of them are irregular. So the word the most common word, the word said, which you need for dialogue, pronouns like they and you, question words like what, where, and who. Children need to learn these words along with the phonics skills that they're learning in those first 2 years, because these are high impact words. If they're high frequency words, it means they appear a lot in the stories they'll encounter, which means learning them will have high positive impact on their reading growth. Any assessments they take and so on will have lots of these words. So we need both in these texts. So I like to push back when I hear some of these more extreme things, and hopefully you will have more nuanced conversations with your colleagues around decodable text. So a lot of people don't realize that the criteria for creating decodable text has actually been determined by two states, the states of Texas and California, because they have put into their reading adoption criteria a definition of what decodable text must be for publishers to sell these books in their states. And because publishers can't create decodable text for every state, they create one set and they use it for everybody. So this is why the decodable texts are the way they are, that you are getting whatever state you are living in. So I think it's worth a few seconds looking at the definition. So here's the California criteria. In decodable text, 75 to 80% of the words consist solely of previously taught letter sound and spelling sound correspondences. So what that means is about 3 out of every 4 words children should be able to fully sound out. And the remaining 20 to 25% of the words, so about 1 out of every 4 words, are previously taught high frequency words that are irregularly spelled, like the word the, said, was, they, or story or content words to make more engaging stories. So by definition, there are a lot of words in decodable text that students can sound out. There are some they can't. And a lot of people don't realize this, but it's really important that we do because it affects how we guide students through these texts. So here's an example of a decodable text in kindergarten. Students have learned all their consonants as well as short A and short I. So if you read this first page, what is it? It is a man. Almost all these words can be sounded out. So if students struggle, like if they struggle with the word man, I can highlight the letter sound they missed, model blending, have them reblend. So I'm going to do a phonics focus. The word that you can't do that with is what, which is one of those irregular high frequency words, a very important word. So I'm going to attack that in a slightly different way, which I'll show in a second. Page 2, what is it? It is a pan. Here again, almost all the words can be sounded out. I know what to do if my students struggle, except for the word what. That is that irregular high frequency word. But things change when we get to page 3. What is it? It is an. All of a sudden, we have a story word to make for a more engaging story, which is allowed in the decodable text criteria. How do we help students attack a story word? Well, this story was written with great care. The writers knew that students knew their consonants and short A and short I. So I direct students' attention to the print, the letters. And I know that they can sound out the first chunk of this word. So we're going to sound that out. It is an app. We don't know the rest of the word. So what are we going to do? We're going to look at the pictures, because in this story, there are these objects and shadows that are very meaningful. So I asked children, what do you see in the shadow that begins with the app sounds? So we look at letters, we think about the sounds, and then we use other sources of information to make meaning. Reading is all about making meaning. So children will very quickly figure out it's an apple. We turn the page and discover that that is correct because dad is making an apple pie. So while we're using lots of different cues, which are now illegal in some states, but you need to in order to read decodable text because of how they're created, the main way of attacking this text is through the phonics, through the sounding out. And we know how critical that is to early reading and writing development and getting the brain ready to become a skilled reader. So I believe that classrooms need a range of text for different instructional purposes. Decodable readers or phonics readers, accountable text play a really critical role in kindergarten and first grade when we're introducing those foundational letters and sounds. You might still need decodable text beyond first grade, maybe in second grade if you have students who haven't mastered those skills in kindergarten or first, and you want some books that have a more concentrated focus. But technically, after we've introduced all the skills in kindergarten 1 and most scope and sequences, every text beyond that point is highly decodable. But it is nice sometimes to have some texts that have extra dosage of words that we are working on so students have more practice. When it comes to those level books and trade books, we might not use very many early on unless maybe we need some extra practice with our high frequency words or so on. But as we move up to the scope and sequence, more and more of these become more closely connected to our scope and sequence, and we can start folding them in. They'll never be as controlled as decodable text, but the decodable texts really serve as a scaffold. So, maybe the decodable texts are 80% controlled, and maybe we start using level books that are only 60%, and that's okay, because as they get more and more skills under their belt, they're going to start noticing more and more sound spellings and words, and it becomes very generative. So that's sort of the decoding piece. And then we have those trade book read alouds to build that language comprehension piece from the simple view of reading, to build that vocabulary, to build that background content knowledge, have those rich conversations with students. And all these kinds of texts play a really critical role. So in terms of a criteria for decodable text beyond what the states have said. Interestingly, in 1985, there was a report that came out called Becoming a Nation of Readers, and they talked about the 3 characteristics of decodable text that were really important, which I think are relevant to our conversation today. They said that these texts needed to be instructive. There need to be a lot of words that you could sound out so you can get mastery of those skills. That makes sense. They need to be comprehensible. They need to make sense. They need to sound like English. Too often I encounter decodable texts today that have not lived up to this criterion. I've encountered a lot of teachers who don't like decodable text because they have been forced to use this kind of text. We must do better. And these texts should be engaging. They should be texts that are worth reading, worth rereading to develop fluency, worth talking about and writing about. And there are companies producing these high quality texts. Not all of them, but there are some, and our students deserve the best. So we need to choose accountable texts that are worth reading, high engagement. So if you see this text here, what is it? This has 6 legs. It is little. It can hop. What is it? A grasshopper. You see lots of short I words, but also short A, short O, so previously taught skills, a couple high frequency words like little and what, and then that story word grasshopper meets all that criteria, high engagement, and so on. Those are the kinds of texts. I like using lots of informational text because they are great springboards for rich conversations, but there's some good fiction ones out there as well. So my issue with decodable text is that they could be far more impactful than they currently are. I see a lot of teachers using them as sort of just a let's get through it kind of event at the end of a lesson and we move on, and we're not taking advantage of all of the learning opportunities with these texts. So yes, we want to read them and focus on modeling decoding and developing fluency with those phonics skills. That is their primary role. But there are other things that we can and should do with these texts that I think you should consider. One is building vocabulary. We don't think of decodable texts as being good for building vocabulary. That's not their instructional intent. With our young learners, we use our read alouds and those rich conversations. But I think because there are so many students with vocabulary issues, we need to think about how we can incorporate more vocabulary work in the reading of these simple texts. So take for an example, this decodable text called Lots of Frogs, short O, very simple words. I see a frog, the frog can hop frog, hop, not a lot of vocabulary opportunities, right? But imagine during my read aloud time that morning, I read an informational text about frogs and frog habitats like red-eyed tree frog. And then we went and read our little decodable book with all these great photographs of frogs in different habitats. Imagine all the language and vocabulary and learning and thinking we could fold into that conversation. When you can make those connections, it's really, really powerful. But it's not always easy to make those connections. What you can do, and what I now do and the teachers I work with do, is preview the book and select a tier 2 academic word that's not in the story. It won't be because the words are simple, but that can be used to talk about the story, to elevate the vocabulary and the conversation around that story. So for this book, Frogs, I worked with my students to sound out the title, and then we talked about the cover illustration. I asked students, where do these frogs live? Some of them knew it was a pond. If they didn't, I told them it was a pond because the word pond is in the story. And then I introduced my tier 2 academic word, habitat. I told students that the place where animals live is called their habitat. I had them repeat the word. And I said, while we read, I want you to look for clues in the words and the pictures to learn more about a frog's habitat. So as we read, I would stop and say, what have you learned so far about a frog's habitat? Turn to your partner, tell them, use the word habitat in your conversation. When we finished reading the book and I had them write about it, I said, make sure you talk about what you learned or write about what you learned about a frog's habitat. Use the word habitat in your writing. Here again, elevating the conversation, building some simple vocabulary. It's a very easy thing to do with any little book you read. All you have to do is preview it, choose that tier 2 academic word, and there you go. Here's another example. This is a decodable story called My Big Trip. Middle first grade, we're focusing on long A word spelled A-I-A-Y. It's about a little girl who's going to Spain. She's riding in a train. She's there in the month of May. So you see all these long A words. And when I previewed it, I thought, well, what she's doing is she's exploring this new country. So I'm going to teach the tier 2 academic word explore. And I used Isabel Beck's Define Example Ask routine because it's such a simple and powerful routine to introduce a new vocabulary. So I defined it using kid-friendly language. Explore means to find out more about something. What does explore mean, class? They would repeat the definition. I gave them an example using the word explore that was relevant to their experiences in the classroom. And then I asked a question that required them to use the word explore in their answer. So I asked, what new place would you like to explore or find out more about? And notice when I asked the question, I reiterated in this parenthetical the meaning of explore, just another hit, another opportunity to connect the known to the new. So we don't want to assume they learned it from this one introduction. We want to keep reinforcing that definition. And as they read, I would ask them questions about what the little girl was exploring and what they would like to explore in the places that she was visiting. The other thing is we want to focus on comprehension. Even though these are simple stories, there are a lot of early reading behaviors we can develop, and we want to make sure students have deep understanding of what they read. These are not word calling events. This is all reading is about making meaning. So I always ask questions while we're reading and model blending and what have you. But after the reading, I always think of 5 questions that go from easy to more complex and have very specific instructional goals that I ask my students. I ask the questions, I have them turn to a partner to answer, so they're all processing their thinking and using language, and then I call on volunteers. And so my first question is always very simple. I focus on a word with a new phonics skill. So in this story, I ask, where did the girl go on a trip? Point to the country's name in the story. So they have to go back in and reread. So during this conversation, we're doing more rereading to develop fluency until they find the word Spain, which is a word with a new phonics skill. Second question is a lower level question. Prompt students to find a detail and support with text evidence. So it might be a lower level question, but I'm making students answer the question by giving me the support, the evidence, the words and sentences that make sure their answer is correct. That is a really important early reading behavior that we can develop in decodable text. So the second question was, what did the girl do in Spain? Find the sentences that tell you. Here again, they're rereading. They're finding the sentences that answer the question. They're turning to the partner, sharing those sentences. So they're reading again, having a conversation, talking it out, and then a volunteer sharing with the class. Lots of thinking, lots of talking, lots of reading. The third and fourth questions are higher level questions. What problems did the girl have on her trip? And where might the girl go on her next trip? Why do you think this? It's really amazing how many inferences we can make in these very simple stories. And then I always connect the book to students' lives. What kind of big trip would you like to go on? And if I had pre-taught the word explore, I would include the word explore in one of these questions. So that last question would have been, what kind of big trip would you like to go on? What would you like to explore there? Tell your partner. So we want to develop comprehension as well, develop early reading behaviors. And then we want to reread these stories in subsequent days. So we want a rereading routine. Maybe the next day we're rereading it with a partner. And the day after that, we're rereading it and making a list of all the words with AI and AY, some of the spelling patterns in the story and so on. And then we're going to continue rereading this book during independent work time and many weeks past this week to continue that learning, hold on to it, and make sure we're developing fluency. Lots of meeting work. And then the last thing I do with these, which is absolutely critical and I almost never see, but is really impactful, is writing about these books. So if I have my students read a book with all these words with long A, spelled AI and AY, and I have them write a summary of the story or a retelling, or I have them put the characters in a new setting, or if it's informational, maybe I have them list facts they learned and so on. What kinds of words do they have to use? They have to use words with long A, spelled AI and AY, the phonics skill. And transferring these skills from reading to writing takes time, and it's very difficult at first. but the book is there as a built-in scaffold. So yes, they're writing a retelling of My Big Trip. They're gonna have to use words with a long A spelled A-I-A-Y, which they're just learning, but they can go back into the story and find those words. Look at those spelling patterns. Think about those patterns when they're writing their sentences and processing their information. So yes, we're doing dictation, both word dictation and sentence dictation and word building and other things to develop encoding. But this is also really important in terms of developing that encoding or spelling piece. And it also is incorporating other things that you're working on in other parts of your literacy block related to writing. And if students need support, you can certainly provide sentence frames or sentence starters to get them started and encourage them to go beyond those frames and starters. So lots of scaffolding can take place in this kind of activity. In these books, there are those high frequency words, some of which are irregular. We know these words are highly impactful. Only about 100 words account for about 50% of the words children will encounter in text. So these words are really important for students to learn and know well. The traditional way of teaching for many, many years was to write a context sentence on the board, like I see a cat, underline the word, say it, have children repeat and move on. But we've learned from brain research, here again, these functional MRIs, that in order for us to really know a word, there are 3 parts of our brain that need to be activated. They're the part where the sounds are stored. So when you say that word, students hear it, that part of their brain is lighting up, if they're paying attention, of course. And then there's the part where the meaning is stored. So that context sentence serves that function. But the part in this old routine that is missing is the part where the letters are stored. In order for us to automatically retrieve or access a word in memory through the process called orthographic mapping, we need to attend to the individual sounds and the individual letters or spellings in a word, even if the word is irregular. So the routine I use to accelerate this orthographic mapping is called the read, spell, write, extend routine. So I introduce the word in context, just like we've done for decades. So if the keyword is said, I'll create a very simple sentence. I see a cat, said Pam. I'll underline the word. And the first thing we do is have students read it. So what's the word? Said. Then I do the orthographic mapping work. We're going to attend to the individual sounds and the spellings, focusing, highlighting the spellings that might be irregular or unknown to students at that point. So I'll ask students, what sounds do you hear in said? Let's say the sounds. Said. What's that first sound? What letter do we write for that sound? The letter S. Do you see it at the beginning of the word? Yes. I do the same thing with the letter D at the end. They know that. So then I say, well, the part of the word that doesn't follow the rules is that middle sound, the S sound, which we normally write using what letter? The letter E, but not in this word, it's AI. So I will circle it or highlight it. Louisa Moats has a routine where she puts a little heart above it. So you might have heard about heart words. Whatever you do, it's fine. It's just to draw attention to the part that the students have to pay extra attention to, the part that they have to remember, because it is either irregular or unknown at that point in their phonics learning. So we read it through that quick orthographic mapping. We spell it out loud, S-A-I-D, and then we write it as we say the letters, S-A-I-D. And then I extend it by giving them a sentence starter or a sentence frame where they get to write the word in context. Some of the words that are irregular actually have other words that behave in the same way, like the word there. There's a word that rhymes with there but ends in E-R-E. That word is where. There are other words that behave the same way that are so-called irregular, like to, do, and who, come and some, give and live, could, should, and would. The only reason I'm pointing these out is these are word families. They're regular word families, but they're word families. Too often when I look at curriculum, these words are not taught as a family. You know, the word could be taught 1 week, should could be many weeks later, and would months later. But if you get to your curriculum and you get to a word like could, fold in should and would, teach it as a family, let students see that regularity and really accelerate the learning. The other thing is that there are words we know a lot of children struggle with, like reversals, on and no, was and saw, words like of, for, and from, which look very similarly but are difficult to attach to meaning. Words that begin with TH and WH, like there and where, then and when, that, what, and then some of those words like one and once, which don't seem to look anything like how they sound. The reason I'm pointing this out is these words require significantly more instructional intention and more assessment opportunities. And in almost every curriculum I look at, these words are given 1 week, like every other word. So look at your scope and sequence for high frequency words. And if you're teaching these in a particular grade, make sure you teach them multiple times throughout the year. Make sure you're folding them into your assessments multiple times throughout the year because they require more. We know that they require more for most students, and you can make those course corrections right away. The fourth and final guidepost is assessment. We know assessment drives instructions and drives instruction. There are lots of ways in which we assess foundational skills. I want to focus in on two types of assessments, comprehensive and cumulative, that have played a critical role in the work I do with students and teachers. So we really need what I call no assumption instruction. We hope that our students progress each year in the way we want, and we build this really strong foundation. But we know the reality, and this has become even more of a reality during the pandemic, is that students get through kindergarten, there might be some learning holes. They carry those into first grade and those holes get bigger. And instead of moving up, up, up and building a strong foundation, their learning really begins to level off because they don't have a strong enough foundation to build on. So our responsibility, regardless of what grade we teach, is to find those lowest level deficits and fill in those holes, plug those holes to build a strong foundation. And once we start plugging those in, we can really accelerate student learning. Yay, then everyone's happy. Yay, she needs to pull down her shirt though. Anyway, so the assessment tool that is absolutely critical to give at the beginning of a school year, and you can give it middle and end as well, is a comprehensive assessment tool where you can find those lowest level skill deficits. So this is the tool I use. I start this, actually, I have a different tool for kindergarten and beginning of first grade. So this is mid first grade on, but certainly beginning of second, third, fourth, fifth, I do this. And what it is, it's a very simple assessment. Students are reading these nonsense words and they're organized around skill categories. So I have a starting point for students who are struggling with previously taught skills. So you see there are short vowel words, short vowels with consonant blends and digraphs, long vowels, complex vowels, and multisyllabic. So imagine you're assessing a third or fourth grader. They do okay, but then they get to long vowels and they begin to fall apart. These are skills taught in first grade. So I know for that student or that group of students, I need to do more work beginning with long vowel sounds and spellings to rebuild that foundation. So this is really critical information for teachers to have. One of the things that is really important to keep in mind when doing any kind of phonics assessment is you must look at the assessment through two lenses, the lens of accuracy and the lens of automaticity. Both give you critical pieces of information. So something as simple as an alphabet assessment, where you might have students say the sounds for these letters. You could have the first student say all the sounds 100%. Second student comes back, all the sounds 100%. You might think, okay, they're at the same place, but not necessarily so. If I told you that the first student got all of these correct and was able to do these in 30 seconds, and the second student got them all correct, but took about 2 minutes, that would give you different pieces of information. So whenever I do any kind of assessment, I'll circle it if it's correct and a check if it's automatic. And then at a glance, I can see accuracy versus automaticity, and I know what skills still need more work, whether it's teaching the skills or whether it's doing more work to get to mastery with those skills. So the assessment that I use that has really transformed my work are cumulative assessments. So at the end of a week, I will pull a small group of students. I can't assess every student every week, and then the teachers I work with can, and it's okay because I might have, and they might have 15 minutes, so I might get through 7 or 8 students because they're just reading a word list. And then every 3 or 4 weeks, I'm assessing them again. And the way these assessments are set up is I'm looking at skills over time. I'm taking that long range view to check for mastery. So if it's week 15, these are 4 words from that week. But I'm also having them read 4 words from week 14, 13, 12, 11, and 10. And so they read these words, they get a check if it's accurate and a check if it's automatic. And then I look at these assessments over time. So this is a student who in week 1, they read these short A words. The next time I saw the student, the short A words were somewhere in the middle of the assessment. And the most recent time, it was at the end of the assessment. So I look at how they do over time, which is a more realistic look at mastery. So I expect lots of checks for accuracy the week I teach it because we've been working on it so hard that week. It's fresh in their memories. If 5 weeks later, some of those checks begin to disappear, that means the learning is starting to slip away. The learning is beginning to decay. Decayed learning is a really critical thing in phonics instruction. If we don't have that robust review and repetition cycle in place, the learning does begin to slip away. And students aren't carrying those skills further, which they need to. So by seeing that the learning is starting to decay for a particular student or a small group of students, I can jump on it and do more intensive work so that the students aren't carrying this learning hole further into the grade or into the next year. In terms of fluency, I don't expect fluency the first week because they're just learning the skill. But if I've done my work and I've given them enough review and repetition, by the time we get to 5 weeks later, it should be check, 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 check for fluency. If it isn't, I'm going to continue working. So I can make very important decisions and make quick course corrections for my whole group of students or just some individual students who need support. So if it's just a few students, that's a small group. I'm going to revisit the lessons for the skills they're struggling with. I'm going to focus on the high impact parts of the lesson where we're blending words, where we're doing dictation to transfer that skill to spelling, where we're doing word building with those letter cards that really develop that flexibility with those letters and sounds, and reading and writing about the decodable text. If it's a lot of students and I see that there's still some mastery issues, I'm going to preview my upcoming lessons and fold those skills in more to activities so that way hit those really, really hard. So those are the 4 big guideposts of early phonics instruction in the science of reading. We looked at the importance of having a clearly defined scope and sequence, that systematic and explicit instruction is far more than just having a scope and sequence. It's building in that robust review and repetition cycle. We need daily application to reading and writing because that's where the learning sticks. And we need some powerful assessment tools that help us stay on top of the learning in real time so that we can make those modifications to better support our students' needs. I want to thank you for joining me today for this quick talk about phonics and the science of reading. I always say to the groups that I work with, I think that reading is one of the greatest gifts we can give children because it's a gift once given can never be taken away and will forever transform a child's life. What you do with your students every day is literally transformative. And I hope that you understand that deeply. I think it's an honor to be able to give that gift to children every year, but also an enormous responsibility to do it right and to do it well. And I thank you for taking the time to listen to my very quick session today about phonics and the science of reading and all that you do to do it right and to do it well. Thank you so much.